forget the grand pronouncements carved in stone for a moment. Today, we're excavating a much more, well, intimate history. One whispered by the very bones of people who lived thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
We're journeying to Bronze Age Nubia in modern Sudan to explore the hidden world of labor etched into their skeletons. A story really waiting to be told.
And what's truly captivating here, I think, is how this investigation centers on the Abu Fatima cemetery. This was a site used between, 2500 and 1500 BCE.
Right. Quite a long time.
Exactly. And this was during the time of the Kerma culture, which was a powerful contemporary, even a rival of ancient Egypt.
So not just some isolated village.
Not at all. Our aim here really is to understand how the daily physical demands, like carrying burdens, actually shaped the bodies of the men and women in this community. It was near Kerma, the capital of Kushite power.
Okay.
So we're not just looking at old bones, we're potentially rewriting the history of labor in this region, especially when it comes to the contributions of women, which are, well, often overlooked.
Exactly. And our detective work, it involves more than just carefully brushing away soil, right?
Oh, definitely.
We're piecing together clues from the archaeological record, the skeletons themselves, obviously, but also alongside glimpses from ancient Egyptian and Nubian art.
Right, the iconography.
And we're even drawing insights from how people carry loads in different cultures today, from Africa, Asia, Latin America. It's like this cross-continental, cross-millennia investigation.
Absolutely. And to truly decipher what we're seeing in these ancient remains, we need to consider something called body techniques.
Body techniques?
Yeah, the anthropologist Marcel Mauss talked about the learned, habitual ways we use our bodies every single day. How we walk, how we lift, how we carry.
Like muscle memory, but broader.
Sort of. Yeah. Think of it as how our culture becomes physically ingrained in us. Bourdieu would talk about habitus. These repeated actions become second nature, and they actually mold our physical forms over time. And Butler's work on gender performativity also reminds us that these repeated actions, which are often gendered, even contribute to how our bodies physically take shape.
So the way these people habitually moved and carried things actually changed the shape and structure of their bones over generations.
Precisely, yeah.
So in a very real sense, bones become a kind of biological archive, a living record of past lives.
That's a great way to put it.
And the fundamental questions we're tackling today are, did the men and women of Abu Fatima have, different ways of carrying things? And can we find telltale signs in their bones that point to specific methods, maybe even something like a tumpline?
That's the strap around the forehead, right?
That's the one, used to support loads carried on the back or head.
Okay.
So maybe let's first set the scene a bit more. Describe Abu Fatima itself.
Good idea.
It was located in Upper Nubia, quite close to Kerma, which was, as we said, a major center during the Bronze Age.
Right near the capital. And this burial site, it was in continuous use throughout the early, middle, and classic Kerma periods. So a long span of time.
Which tells us something in itself.
It does. Its importance really lies in giving us a window into a community that likely provided essential labor for that thriving capital nearby.
Okay, sort of a peri-urban community, maybe?
That's a good term for it, yeah. And even in their final resting place, we see clues about this, relatively homogeneous community. Although, there's this one individual, 882, who really throws a curveball into that picture later on. We'll get to her.
Intriguing. And the way they buried their dead also offers clues, you mentioned.
It does. Simple pits, usually. The body's placed in a flexed position, often resting on cowhides or maybe wooden beds.
Okay.
You mentioned some exceptions, like ostrich feather fans and silver beads, suggesting some individuals had access to more valuable items.
Right. A bit more status, perhaps.
Perhaps. But overall, it seems like a fairly, let's say, egalitarian community in terms of burial goods, at least compared to the elite burials at Kerma itself.
Got it.
Now, the study we're diving into today focused on 30 adult skeletons, 14 women and 16 men.
Okay.
And that was out of roughly 40 that were excavated.
Why only 30 out of 40?
Well, sadly, due to looting over time and just the natural processes of decay, many remains were fragmented. Particularly the skulls, actually. Which means not every skeleton could be used for every single type of analysis we wanted to do.
Right, that makes sense. So this is the crucial part then. How do you go from these ancient, sometimes fragmented bones to understanding something as specific as how someone carried a heavy load? What's the scientific process here?
This is where a multi-proxy approach comes in. It sounds technical, but it just means the researchers didn't rely on one single piece of evidence.
Okay.
They examined 17 different skeletal features known to be associated with carrying weight. These fall into a few key categories.
Right.
First, enthesial changes. Think of these as changes at the spots where muscles actually attach to the bone.
Okay, like where the tendon connects?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a weightlifter. Over time, their muscles get bigger and stronger. They can leave bigger, rougher marks on the bone where they attach.
I see.
We see similar kinds of changes in ancient skeletons that tell us about repeated, strenuous muscle use. Then there's osteoarthritis.
Right, joint wear and tear.
Essentially, wear and tear on the joints.
Mm-hmm.
In this study, they specifically looked at the humeroscapular joint, that's the shoulder joint.
Ah, okay.
Like what you might see in someone who's done a lot of heavy lifting with their arms or carried things on their shoulder.
Okay, so changes in muscle attachments and wear on the shoulder joint. What other clues were they looking for?
They also looked at vertebral pathology, basically. Changes in the spine.
Backbone.
Yep. This includes general wear and tear, degenerative changes, but also something called Schmorl's nodes.
Schmorl's nodes?
Yeah, they're like little bulges or herniations of the disc material into the vertebral bone itself, often linked to heavy compressive forces.
Ouch. Okay.
They looked for these in the neck bones, the cervical vertebrae, the mid-back, thoracic, and the lower back, lumbar, all three regions.
Got it.
And finally, they examined what are called unintentional cranial modifications.
On the skull itself.
On the skull, yes. Things like postcoronal depression, that's a sort of flattening or concavity on the back part of the top of the skull.
Okay.
As well as changes in other bony features at the back of the head,
right,
like the occipital torus and near the mastoid process.
That sounds incredibly detailed, and I imagine the first crucial step before you even look for those things is figuring out if you're looking at a male or female skeleton and roughly how old they were when they died.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
Standard methods in osteology, the study of bones, were used. For sex estimation, they primarily look at the shape and size differences in the skull, and especially the pelvis.
The pelvis is usually key.
Very diagnostic, yes.
Yeah.
For age, they examine things like the degree of fusion of different parts of the skull bones, the state of the pubic symphysis in the pelvis, and the general condition of joint surfaces.
Okay.
The researchers focused on adults, roughly between 18 and maybe 60 years old, to avoid the complexities of still growing bones in younger individuals and very advanced age-related degeneration in the really elderly.
Makes sense. And to make sense of all this intricate data, all these measurements and observations, they use statistical analysis?
Yes, they use specific statistical tests, like the Mann-Whitney U test and Kruskal-Wallis H test. These are designed for comparing groups when your data doesn't necessarily fit a perfect bell curve, which is common with skeletal data.
Right.
These tests help researchers see if the differences they observe between, say, men and women, or between different age groups, are likely to be real differences and not just random chance.
Okay.
But it's worth noting, especially with a limited number of skeletons like this,
Yeah.
that even if a difference isn't statistically significant according to the test, doesn't automatically mean there's no real biological difference there.
Yeah.
You have to look at the overall patterns in the data, too.
Right. Statistics aren't everything, especially with smaller samples from the past.
Okay, so after all this detailed analysis, looking at muscle attachments, joints, spines, skulls, what story do these bones actually tell us about the lives of these men and women? How do they carry their loads? Were there clear differences between the sexes?
The findings, well, they strongly suggest distinct patterns related to gender, yes.
Okay.
The men showed more prominent unilateral enthesial changes, meaning the muscle attachments on one side of their body were more developed than the other.
One side stronger than the other.
Exactly. Along with more wear and tear, more osteoarthritis in their shoulder joints, the humeroscapular joint.
Ah.
This pattern strongly points to activities where they were regularly carrying loads primarily on one shoulder.
That's fascinating, like maybe carrying a heavy bag or tool slung over one shoulder.
That's a very likely explanation for that kind of skeletal pattern, yes. They would have considered various forms of asymmetrical labor, but single shoulder carrying is a common one. That makes intuitive sense. Doing that repeatedly would certainly lead to that kind of imbalance in muscle development and joint stress over time. Okay, so what about the women? What did their bones reveal about their daily activities?
The women, well, in contrast, they displayed more pronounced degenerative changes, more wear and hair, specifically in their cervical vertebrae.
The bones in their necks.
Exactly, the neck bones. This indicates frequent and significant musculoskeletal use, stress, on their upper necks.
Wow, okay.
And what's particularly interesting is that post-coronal depression, that flattening on the back of the skull we mentioned,
Yeah.
which can be a telltale sign of using a tumpline, that strap around the forehead,
Right.
was observed in some of the female skulls they could examine.
So the wear and tear on their bodies is telling a really different story. Men's shoulders show the strain, while the women's necks and heads seem to bear the brunt of the load.
Precisely.
What were the general trends when they looked at all these indicators together? Was one sex just generally more worn down?
It's a bit nuanced. Overall, the female individuals tended to show slightly higher levels of bone remodeling, these skeletal changes, across most of the markers they studied.
Okay.
However, the men showed clearly higher levels, specifically in those enthesial changes, the muscle markings, and that shoulder osteoarthritis we just discussed.
Right, the shoulder loading signature.
Exactly. But when it came to the vertebral changes, especially in the neck, and those cranial modifications like the post-coronal depression, the trends generally pointed towards higher levels in the women.
Interesting. You mentioned a specific individual earlier, 8A2. You said she threw a curveball. This sounds like a particularly illuminating case. Tell us her story.
Yeah, individual 882. She was a woman who lived to be over 50 years old, which was, a pretty significant lifespan for the time.
Definitely.
And interestingly, she was buried with some items considered quite luxurious for that community, and period, an ostrich feather fan, a leather cushion, things like that.
Okay, so maybe higher status.
Potentially. And adding to the intrigue, chemical analysis of her bones, isotope analysis, suggests she was actually a migrant, probably from the Second Cataract region, which is quite a journey from Abu Fatima.
Wow, okay. So a migrant woman, buried with nice things. And her bones themselves, what did they tell you about her actual life, her labor?
Her skeleton showed really significant post-coronal depression, that's skull flattening, and also severe osteoarthritis in her cervical vertebrae, her neck.
Severe.
Quite severe, yes. The researchers interpret this combination of skeletal features as really strong evidence that she likely used tumplines extensively throughout her life to carry heavy loads.
Heavy loads like what?
Well, water, goods, maybe even including children in baskets, which we see depicted elsewhere.
And what's really striking is that despite her relatively high-status burial, the fan and cushion, her body clearly bears the marks of significant, strenuous physical labor, likely head-loading over many years. That's just mind-blowing. So even someone buried with potential indicators of higher status shows this evidence of intense physical labor. It really flips your assumptions about who did what kind of work back then.
It absolutely does. It challenges any simplistic idea that maybe upper-class women, if we can even use that term, were exempt from heavy physical work.
Her body tells a different story.
It really does underscore that even without written records, the body itself holds such a powerful history if we know how to read it. Okay, let's talk about age for a second. Did they see different patterns of these skeletal changes in younger versus older adults in Abu Fatima? Did the work change as people got older?
Yes. I mean, in general, some bone remodeling, some degenerative change tended to increase with age in both sexes. That's a pretty natural process.
Sure.
However, when they look specifically at differences between the left and right sides of the body, bilateral asymmetry in middle age versus older adults, they found some interesting patterns.
Women seem to show a relatively consistent low level of asymmetry, favoring their right side in both middle and old age.
So, fairly balanced, but maybe slightly favoring the right throughout.
Something like that. It suggests they might have engaged in fairly consistent work patterns involving both sides of the body throughout much of their adult lives.
But the men showed a different trend as they aged, right? You mentioned that.
Exactly. Men appeared to shift. They showed more pronounced asymmetry on their right side in middle age.
Okay, maybe a dominant hand thing.
Could be related to dominant hand use in tasks, yes. But then in older age, the pattern seemed to shift towards having more pronounced changes on their left side.
Left side. Why would that be?
Well, the researchers suggest this could indicate a change in their primary activities later in life. Or perhaps, and this is quite plausible, they were compensating for more wear and tear accumulated on their dominant right side as they got older, shifting the load, so to speak.
Interesting, like adapting to previous strain.
Possibly. However, it's really important to remember the number of older men in the sample was relatively small.
Right, the sample size caveat again.
Exactly. So these findings about the age shift in men need to be interpreted with some caution. But overall, the relatively symmetrical upper limb enthesial changes in the women aligns with other research suggesting they were involved in a variety of tasks, maybe using both sides of their bodies quite regularly throughout their lives.
So the bones are painting this picture of daily tasks, gendered patterns, maybe even changes with age. But you also mentioned art and modern-day examples. How did those pieces fit into understanding the use of something like a tumpline in Bronze Age Nubia? Beyond the bones themselves, what other clues do we have?
Right. This is where we look for that corroborating evidence, the different lines of inquiry coming together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, while we don't have direct artistic depictions of women in Bronze Age Nubia specifically using tumplines from that exact Abu Fatima time period, we have to remember that visual representations of people, especially non-elites, from that specific Kerma culture era are generally quite rare.
Right. Art often focuses on kings and gods.
Precisely. However, slightly later, during the New Kingdom period in Egypt, when Egypt controlled Nubia, we do see Egyptian depictions of captured Nubian women. And in these scenes, they are carrying children in baskets, using what are clearly tumplines around their foreheads.
Ah. Okay, so Egyptian art, but showing Nubians.
Yes. And even though these are, scenes of conquest and tribute, kind of propaganda,
Sure.
the fact that these women are shown wearing recognizably Nubian clothing and using this specific technique is significant, isn't it?
Yeah, it suggests this wasn't something the Egyptians forced them to do in that moment, but rather a common practice within their own culture.
Precisely. It strongly implies that this was a traditional, known way for Nubian women to carry loads. And we also find similar depictions much, much later, during the Meroitic period in Nubia that's centuries after Abu Fatima, but still in the same region. Again, showing Nubian women with tumplines.
So it seems like a long-standing tradition, potentially.
Potentially, yes. And interestingly, Nubian men are almost never depicted using tumplines in any ancient art from this entire region. It seems strongly associated with women.
Fascinating. And when we look at how people carry things in different cultures today, what does that tell us about the potential use and impact of tumplines, the ethnographic evidence?
Right, the ethnographic parallels. Studies from diverse cultures around the globe think of indigenous communities in North America, like the Ojibwe, or groups in East Africa, like the Kikuyu, or in Central and South America, Guatemala, for instance.
Yeah.
Show that women frequently use tumplines to carry very heavy loads, sometimes equivalent to, say, 20% or even more of their own body weight.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And these ethnographic studies also often document the physical effects of this long-term practice on the skeleton, particularly on the head and neck vertebrae, similar to what we see in the Abu Fatima women.
So when you put it all together, the specific wear patterns in the neck and skull bones of the Abu Fatima women, the later artistic depictions of Nubian women clearly using tumplines,
Right.
and the widespread use of this exact technique by women in other cultures, often with similar skeletal consequences. What's the most likely conclusion about how these Bronze Age women were carrying heavy loads?
Well, the convergence of all these different lines of evidence, the bones, the art, the ethnography, it strongly suggests that women in this Bronze Age Nubian community were frequently carrying heavy loads using their heads, and almost certainly with the aid of tumplines.
Okay.
This habitual head-loading practice left distinctive, observable marks on their cervical vertebrae and, in some cases, their skulls.
While
the skeletal evidence for the men points to different load-carrying methods, likely involving carrying burdens primarily on their shoulders, maybe using poles or yokes, or just slinging things over one shoulder.
It's just such a powerful reminder that when we look beyond to traditional historical focus, the texts written by elite men usually, we can uncover the often unseen but clearly significant physical contributions of women in ancient societies. Their labor is written on their bones.
Absolutely. This study beautifully illustrates how deeply ingrained social roles, gender divisions of labor, and just everyday activities become literally etched into our bodies, and how the skeletal record can preserve these patterns for thousands of years.
Yeah.
It also opens up the possibility, though, that head loading using tumplines wasn't the only method women used. Other artistic evidence might suggest other ways of carrying things on the head as well, like balanced baskets. But the tumpline evidence seems quite strong here for strenuous loads.
Right, it's probably complex. Now, of course, with any study that looks back thousands of years using fragmented evidence, there are going to be limitations. We have to be careful. What were some of the key limitations acknowledged in this research?
Oh, definitely. There are always limitations, and it's crucial to acknowledge them. First, as we've mentioned, the sample size of skeletons, particularly for the cranial remains where things like post-coronal depression are observed.
Yeah.
And also, when you start breaking the sample down into specific age and sex groups, it gets relatively small.
Which affects the statistics.
It limits the statistical power, exactly, and how broadly we can confidently generalize these findings to the entire Abu Fatima population, let alone all of Bronze Age Nubia.
Okay, what else?
Also, while modern ethnographic examples are incredibly helpful for suggesting possibilities,
Right.
directly equating practices from today or even recent history with those of people living 4,000 years ago in Bronze Age Nubia, well, that has its challenges. Cultures change.
True. Can't assume a direct one-to-one link.
Exactly. And as we discussed earlier, it's always complex in bioarchaeology to completely separate out the effects of normal aging, the specific mechanical stress of load carrying, and other underlying health factors or natural degenerative processes on the bones. They all interact.
It's never just one cause.
Rarely. And finally, a practical issue with this specific site was that the skeletons weren't perfectly evenly distributed across the different time phases of the Kerma culture, early, middle, classic.
Oh, okay.
Which made it difficult to really track potential changes in load-carrying practices over that long period of occupation.
Gotcha. So, despite these limitations, the sample size, the ethnographic comparisons, the complexity of bone changes, the time distribution, the main insight, the core finding, is still incredibly significant, isn't it?
It absolutely is. I think the real aha moment here is recognizing, through this hard skeletal evidence, that these Bronze Age Nubian women were physically carrying the weight of their society, quite literally, through these demanding head-loading practices. And this has left a lasting, visible mark on their skeletons, a story that written history largely overlooks or can't tell us, but that this kind of interdisciplinary research brings vividly to light.
It really makes you wonder about all the other forms of invisible labor throughout history, doesn't it? Labor is often performed by women or by other marginalized groups that just didn't get recorded in the same way as, say, battles or royal decrees.
Exactly. It prompts us to ask, how many other contributions, how many other lived experiences of overlooked groups might be revealed if we apply similar careful bioarchaeological investigations elsewhere? It could lead us to really rethink our traditional historical narratives.
What other silences in history might our bones be able to break if we just learn how to listen to them, how to read them?
That's a perfect way to phrase it. What stories are waiting in the archives of our own bodies?
And this kind of research is ongoing, I understand. There's still more to learn from places like Abu Fatima.
Oh, yes, absolutely. This study highlights the great potential for future research, hopefully with larger samples of skeletons recovered carefully, and by continuing to combine skeletal analysis with archaeology, iconography, maybe even ancient DNA or isotope studies.
Right, bringing all the tools together.
Exactly. We can further illuminate the lives, the health, the labor, the mobility, and the contributions of the Abu Fatima community and other ancient populations around the world.
Well, it certainly makes you think differently about the past and maybe even about the physical demands of different kinds of work in our own societies today.
Right.
How our own bodies are constantly being shaped by the activities we engage in day after day. Thank you so much for shedding light on this fascinating and kind of hidden history.
My pleasure. It's a story worth telling.